Sarah Martinez had always been different from other women her age. At 28, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that most people mistook for shyness. Her dark hair was usually pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she preferred jeans and comfortable sweaters over flashy outfits. What people didn't know was that Sarah had spent the last 8 years serving as a Navy SEAL, one of only a handful of women to ever complete the grueling training program. After her discharge 6 months ago, Sarah had moved to the small town of Milbrook, hoping to find some peace and normalcy. She rented a modest apartment above the local bakery and took a job at the town library. The quiet life suited her perfectly after years of high-stakes missions in places she couldn't talk about. She enjoyed helping elderly residents find books about gardening and assisting students with their homework. Nobody in town knew about her military background, and that's exactly how she wanted it. The trouble started on a Friday evening in late October. Sarah had finished her shift at the library and decided to stop by Murphy's Tavern for a quiet dinner. The restaurant was one of the few places in town that stayed open past 8 o'clock, and their chicken sandwich was surprisingly good. She chose a corner booth near the window, ordered her meal, and pulled out a paperback novel to read while she ate. Murphy's Tavern was known as a local hangout for blue-collar workers and college students from the nearby community college. Most nights it was peaceful enough, but Friday evenings sometimes brought trouble. Tonight, a group of 5 young men had been drinking heavily since late afternoon. They were loud, obnoxious, and clearly looking for entertainment at someone else's expense. The leader of the group was Jake Morrison, a 25-year-old construction worker who fancied himself the toughest guy in town. He had been in and out of jail for bar fights and had a reputation for picking on people he thought were easy targets. His friends, Tommy, Rick, Dave, and Mike, were followers who laughed at his jokes and backed him up when he started trouble. Sarah noticed them when they first walked in, but she had dealt with drunk bullies before. She kept her head down and continued reading, hoping they would focus their attention elsewhere. Unfortunately, Jake had other plans. He nudged Tommy and pointed toward Sarah's table. "Look at that stuck-up chick over there," Jake said loudly enough for half the restaurant to hear. "Thinks she's too good to even look at us." Sarah heard the comment but didn't react. She had learned long ago that responding to provocations often made situations worse. She turned a page in her book and took another bite of her sandwich, maintaining her calm exterior while mentally assessing the situation. 5 men, all intoxicated, all looking for trouble. The restaurant was half empty, with only an elderly couple near the front and a young family with 2 small children across the room. Jake wasn't satisfied with being ignored. He stood up from his table and walked over to Sarah's booth, his friends following behind like a pack of hyenas. The alcohol had made him bold and stupid, a dangerous combination. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Jake said, sliding uninvited into the seat across from Sarah. "It's rude to ignore people when they're being friendly." Sarah looked up from her book for the first time, meeting Jake's bloodshot eyes with a steady gaze. "I'm just trying to enjoy my dinner in peace," she said quietly. "Please leave me alone." Her calm response only seemed to irritate Jake more. He reached across the table and grabbed her book, tossing it onto the floor. "There, now you can pay attention to us instead of that stupid book." The restaurant had gone quiet. The elderly couple near the front looked nervous, and the family with children was clearly uncomfortable. The bartender, an older man named Pete, watched the situation with growing concern but seemed unsure about how to intervene. Sarah remained perfectly still, her hands folded on the table. Years of training had taught her to stay calm under pressure and to never escalate a situation unless absolutely necessary. "Please give me my book back and return to your table," she said in the same quiet tone. Jake laughed and turned to his friends. "Did you hear that? She's giving me orders." His friends laughed along, emboldened by their leader's behavior. "Maybe you need to learn some manners, sweetheart. Maybe we need to teach you how to show proper respect." What Jake and his friends didn't understand was that they were making a serious mistake. Sarah had been trained to handle much more dangerous situations than a group of drunk bullies in a small-town restaurant. She had faced armed enemies in hostile territory and had been decorated for her service. But her training had also taught her restraint and de-escalation techniques. "I don't want any trouble," Sarah said, her voice still calm, but with an edge that Jake was too drunk to notice. "Just let me finish my meal and I'll be on my way." Instead of backing down, Jake reached across the table and grabbed Sarah's wrist. You'll leave when I say you can leave, he snarled. First, you're going to apologize for being rude, and then maybe you can buy us a round of drinks. That's when Sarah's patience finally reached its limit. Years of suppressed frustration from dealing with men who thought they could intimidate women because of their size came bubbling to the surface. Jake had just crossed a line that he didn't even know existed. The atmosphere in the restaurant changed in that instant. Sarah's entire demeanor shifted from passive to alert, though the change was so subtle that only someone with military training would have noticed it. Her breathing became more controlled, her posture straightened slightly, and her eyes took on a focus that would have made Jake reconsider his actions if he had been sober enough to recognize the warning signs. But Jake Morrison was about to learn a lesson that would change his life forever. He was about to discover why you should never ever provoke someone whose training and experience far exceed your ability to comprehend the consequences of your actions. Sarah looked down at Jake's hand gripping her wrist, then back up at his face with an expression that should have been a clear warning. "Let go of my arm," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. There was something in her tone that made the hair on the back of Pete the bartender's neck stand up. But Jake was too drunk and too arrogant to recognize danger when it was staring him in the face. "Or what?" Jake sneered, tightening his grip. "You gonna call for help? Gonna cry?" His friends laughed and moved closer, forming a semicircle around the booth. Tommy pulled out his phone and started recording, thinking this would make a funny video to share later. Sarah had given Jake every opportunity to walk away. She had tried de-escalation, had tried reasoning, had even tried ignoring the situation completely. But some people only understood one language, and Jake Morrison was clearly one of those people. In one fluid motion that happened so fast the human eye could barely follow it, Sarah twisted her wrist in a way that broke Jake's grip, while simultaneously grabbing his thumb and bending it backward at an angle that made him scream in pain. Before he could react, she had stood up and applied a pressure point technique that dropped him to his knees beside the booth. "Holy hell," Tommy shouted, nearly dropping his phone. The other three friends stood frozen in shock, not understanding how their tough guy leader had gone from being in control to whimpering on the floor in the span of 2 seconds. Sarah released the pressure point and stepped back, giving Jake room to stand up. "This doesn't have to go any further," she said calmly. "Take your friends and leave. We can all pretend this never happened." Jake struggled to his feet, his face red with pain and humiliation. The restaurant was dead silent except for the sound of his heavy breathing and the soft whimpering of one of the children at the family table, who had started crying when Jake screamed. But instead of taking Sarah's offer and walking away, Jake made the second biggest mistake of his life. His pride had been wounded in front of his friends, and his alcohol-clouded judgment told him that he couldn't let a woman embarrass him like that. He had to prove he was still the tough guy everyone thought he was. "You think you're smart?" Jake snarled, rubbing his injured thumb. "Let's see how smart you are when all 5 of us teach you a lesson." Rick, the biggest of Jake's friends at about 6 feet 4 inches and 250 pounds, cracked his knuckles. Yeah, nobody disrespects Jake like that, especially not some skinny librarian. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. These men weren't going to be reasonable. They weren't going to walk away and leave her in peace. They were going to force her to do something she had hoped never to do again outside of a military context. But if they wanted to escalate this situation, she was more than prepared to finish it. "Last chance," Sarah said, her voice now carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life or death situations. "Walk away now or face the consequences of your choices." Jake looked around the restaurant and saw that Pete had reached for the phone, probably to call the police. The elderly couple was huddled together near the front door, clearly terrified. The family with children was trying to quietly gather their things and leave. But Jake was beyond caring about witnesses or consequences. His masculine pride had been challenged, and in his drunken state that was the only thing that mattered. "Get her," Jake shouted, pointing at Sarah. Rick moved first, rushing toward Sarah with his arms outstretched like he was going to tackle her. It was exactly the kind of clumsy, telegraphed attack that Sarah had been trained to counter since her early days in the military. She sidestepped at the last second, grabbed Rick's extended arm and used his own momentum to send him crashing into the booth where she had been sitting moments before. The table collapsed under his weight with a tremendous crash, sending plates and glasses flying. Tommy tried to grab Sarah from behind while she was dealing with Rick, but she had been aware of his movement from the moment he started toward her. She drove her elbow backward into his solar plexus, knocking the wind out of him and sending him stumbling backward into Dave, who wasn't expecting the collision. Both men went down in a tangle of arms and legs. Mike, the smallest of the group, looked at his three friends on the ground and suddenly realized that maybe this wasn't going according to plan. He started backing toward the door, his hands raised in surrender. "Hey, I don't want any part of this," he said. "This is crazy." But Jake wasn't finished. Seeing his friends being systematically dismantled by a woman who looked like she weighed maybe 130 pounds had sent him into a rage that overrode any sense of self-preservation he might have had left. He grabbed a beer bottle from the nearest table and smashed it against the edge, creating a jagged weapon. "Now let's see how tough you are," Jake said, advancing on Sarah with the broken bottle held out in front of him. This was the moment Sarah had been dreading. Up until now, she had been using minimal force, trying to disable rather than seriously injure. But a broken bottle was a deadly weapon, and Jake had just crossed the line from simple assault to attempted murder. Her military training kicked in completely, overriding any civilian inhibitions she might have had. Sarah's entire posture changed. The mild-mannered librarian disappeared completely, replaced by the elite warrior she had been trained to be. Her movements became more precise, more economical, more deadly. This wasn't about self-defense anymore. This was about survival. Pete, the bartender, finally got through to the emergency dispatcher. "I need police and ambulances at Murphy's Tavern right now," he said into the phone. "There's a fight happening and someone's got a weapon." But by the time help arrived, the situation would be over. Sarah Martinez was about to remind everyone present why Navy SEALs are considered among the most dangerous people on the planet, and why provoking one is always a very, very bad idea. The moment Jake raised the broken bottle, Sarah's military training completely took over. Years of combat experience in some of the world's most dangerous places had programmed her to respond to deadly threats with swift, decisive action. She no longer saw Jake as a drunk bully in a small-town restaurant. He was now an armed enemy combatant who posed an immediate threat to her life and the lives of innocent civilians. Jake lunged forward with the jagged bottle, aiming for Sarah's face. He was probably trying to scare her more than actually hurt her, but Sarah couldn't take that chance. A broken bottle could cause permanent disfigurement or death, and she had been trained never to assume an attacker's intentions were anything less than lethal. Sarah moved with the fluid precision of someone who had practiced these techniques thousands of times. She stepped to the side, grabbed Jake's wrist as it passed by and applied a joint lock that made him drop the bottle instantly. But she didn't stop there. In one continuous motion, she pivoted on her heel and drove her elbow into Jake's face with enough force to break his nose and send him flying backward into the sound of Jake's body. Hitting the wooden bar was followed immediately by the crash of bottles and glasses falling to the floor. Blood poured from his shattered nose as he slumped against the bar. Semi-conscious and no longer a threat to anyone, Rick had managed to get back on his feet and was reaching for a chair, apparently planning to use it as a weapon. Sarah turned toward him with the cold efficiency of a predator. Rick suddenly found himself looking into the eyes of someone who had killed enemy combatants in close-quarters combat. And something primitive in his brain finally recognized the danger he was in. "Please," Rick whispered, dropping the chair. "I don't want to fight anymore." But Sarah was no longer operating on the same level as these amateur troublemakers. Combat mode had been activated, and her training dictated that she neutralize all potential threats before assessing the situation. Rick had already shown hostile intent by attacking her earlier, and she couldn't risk him picking up another weapon or attacking the civilians in the restaurant. Sarah closed the distance between them in 2 quick steps and delivered a precise strike to a pressure point on Rick's neck. He collapsed immediately, unconscious but alive. Her training had taught her exactly how much force to use to incapacitate without causing permanent damage. But to the untrained observers in the restaurant, it looked like she had barely touched him. Tommy and Dave were still on the ground where they had fallen when Tommy crashed into Dave. They were both conscious, but clearly had no desire to continue the fight. They had watched their 2 toughest friends get dismantled by a woman who looked like she belonged behind a library desk. And whatever alcohol-fueled bravado they had walked in with was completely gone. "We give up," Tommy shouted, holding his hands above his head. "We don't want any more trouble." Dave was nodding frantically in agreement. "Yeah, we're done. We're sorry. Please don't hurt us." Mike, The smallest of the group was already at the door and looking like he was about to bolt into the night, but Sarah's voice stopped him in his tracks. "Nobody leaves," she said, her tone carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Everyone stays right where they are until the police arrive." The transformation in Sarah was so complete that even Pete the bartender, who had seen plenty of fights in his 30 years of running the tavern, was staring at her in shock. This wasn't the quiet woman who had been reading a book and eating a chicken sandwich just minutes earlier. This was someone else entirely. Someone dangerous and competent in ways that made him very grateful she was on the side of law and order. The elderly couple near the front door was huddled together, too frightened to move. The family with children had managed to get their kids under the table and was shielding them from the violence. Everyone in the restaurant was looking at Sarah with a mixture of awe and terror. Outside, the sound of police sirens was getting closer. Pete's emergency call had gotten a quick response, probably because Milbrook was a small town where a fight with weapons was considered a major incident. Sarah heard the sirens and began to mentally prepare for what would happen next. She would have to explain who she was and what had happened. Her military background would come out, and her quiet life as a small-town librarian would be over. The local police would probably handle the situation professionally, but there would be questions, reports, and possibly even media attention if the story got out. But all of that was secondary to the fact that she had protected herself and the innocent people in the restaurant from a group of violent men who had refused every opportunity to walk away peacefully. She had done what she was trained to do, and she felt no regret about her actions. Jake was starting to regain consciousness, groaning and holding his broken nose. Blood was still flowing freely, and he would need medical attention. Rick remained unconscious but was breathing normally. Tommy and Dave were still on the ground with their hands raised, clearly terrified of moving without permission. Sarah looked around the restaurant one more time, taking inventory of the situation. 2 men down and incapacitated, 2 surrendering, 1 trying to leave but obeying her order to stay. No civilians injured, minimal property damage considering the circumstances. From a tactical standpoint, it had been a textbook operation. But from a personal standpoint, Sarah knew that her life in Milbrook would never be the same. The quiet anonymity she had craved after years of military service was about to disappear forever. By tomorrow, everyone in town would know exactly who she was and what she was capable of. The police sirens were getting very close now. In just a few minutes, officers would burst through the door expecting to find a chaotic brawl, only to discover 5 men who had been systematically neutralized by a woman who looked like she couldn't hurt a fly. Sarah took a deep breath and prepared to explain how a simple dinner at a local restaurant had turned into a demonstration of why you should never, ever underestimate someone based on their appearance. 3 police cruisers screeched to a halt outside Murphy's Tavern, their red and blue lights painting the restaurant windows in alternating colors. Officer Jennifer Walsh was the first through the door, her hand on her weapon as she surveyed what she expected to be a chaotic scene. Instead, she found something that didn't make immediate sense. 5 men were scattered around the restaurant in various states of distress. 1 was slumped against the bar with blood all over his face. Another was unconscious on the floor. 2 were sitting with their hands raised in surrender. The 5th was standing by the door looking like he wanted to disappear into the floor. And in the middle of it all stood a petite woman in jeans and a sweater, looking completely calm and unruffled. "What happened here?" Officer Walsh asked, looking around the room in confusion. Pete, the bartender, pointed at Sarah. "Those 5 guys started harassing her, and when they wouldn't leave her alone, she did that to them." Officer Walsh looked at Sarah with new interest. She had been a police officer for 12 years and had seen plenty of bar fights. But she had never seen 5 grown men taken down by 1 small woman, without the woman showing any signs of injury or even dishevelment. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to explain what happened here," Officer Walsh said, approaching Sarah carefully. She wasn't sure if this woman was a victim or a perpetrator, and the scene was unlike anything she had encountered before. Sarah nodded and straightened her shoulders slightly. "My name is Sarah Martinez. I'm a former Navy SEAL. These men approached me while I was having dinner and became increasingly aggressive when I asked them to leave me alone. The situation escalated when that man," she pointed to Jake, who was still holding his broken nose, "threatened me with a broken bottle. I defended myself using minimal necessary force, The other two officers who had entered behind Walsh exchanged glances. Navy SEAL? That explained a lot about what they were seeing, but it also raised new questions. Female Navy SEALs were extremely rare, and they were all highly trained in combat techniques that most people couldn't even imagine. Officer Walsh keyed her radio. "Dispatch, we're going to need 2 ambulances at Murphy's Tavern. We have injured parties that need medical attention. Also, please run a background check on Sarah Martinez, former Navy SEAL." While they waited for the ambulances and the background check, Officer Walsh began taking statements from the witnesses. The elderly couple near the front told a story of escalating harassment that ended when the men attacked Sarah with weapons. The family with children corroborated the account, with the father emphasizing that Sarah had tried repeatedly to defuse the situation peacefully. Pete, the bartender, provided the most detailed account. "She kept asking them to leave her alone," he told Officer Walsh. "She never raised her voice, never threatened anyone, never did anything to provoke them. They kept pushing and pushing until that idiot Jake pulled out a broken bottle. That's when well, I've never seen anything like it. It was like watching a professional fighter against a bunch of amateurs." Tommy and Dave, still sitting on the ground with their hands raised, confirmed the witnesses' accounts. They were both sober enough now to realize how badly they had misjudged the situation, and they were eager to cooperate with the police in hopes of reducing whatever charges they would face. "She told us to leave multiple times," Dave admitted. "We should have listened. We thought we were just having some fun, but she was trying to avoid exactly what happened." Mike, still standing by the door, nodded in agreement. "Jake was drunk and acting stupid. She didn't do anything wrong. She was just defending herself when he came at her with that bottle." Officer Walsh's radio crackled to life. "Officer Walsh, that background check came back. Sarah Martinez, age 28, honorably discharged Navy SEAL with multiple commendations for valor. Clean record, no arrests, exemplary service record. She's legitimate." As if there had been any doubt after seeing the results of her handiwork, the background check confirmed what everyone in the restaurant had witnessed. Sarah Martinez was exactly who she claimed to be, and she had done exactly what she was trained to do when faced with multiple armed attackers. The ambulances arrived and paramedics began treating Jake's broken nose and checking Rick, who was starting to regain consciousness. Neither man had life-threatening injuries, but they would both need hospital treatment. Jake would require surgery to repair his nose, and Rick had a concussion from the pressure point technique Sarah had used. As the paramedics worked, Officer Walsh completed her investigation. The physical evidence, witness statements, and security camera footage from the restaurant all told the same story. 5 men had harassed and then attacked one woman, who had defended herself with professional efficiency. There was no question about who was at fault or what charges would be filed. "Ms. Martinez," Officer Walsh said, approaching Sarah again, "based on our investigation, it's clear that you acted in self-defense. However, I do need to inform you that there will likely be some paperwork and possibly a hearing just as a formality. Given the extent of the injuries and the number of people involved, the district attorney's office will want to review everything." Sarah nodded. She had expected as much. "I understand, officer. I'm prepared to cooperate fully with any investigation. I have documentation of my military service and training if needed." Jake was being loaded onto a stretcher, still conscious but heavily medicated for pain. As he passed by Sarah, he looked up at her with a mixture of fear and hatred. "This isn't over," he mumbled through his damaged nose. Sarah looked down at him with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the entire incident. "Yes, it is," she said quietly. "And if you're smart, you'll make sure it stays that way." Officer Walsh heard the exchange and stepped closer to Jake's stretcher. "Mr. Morrison, I strongly advise you to consider this matter completely closed. Ms. Martinez has shown remarkable restraint tonight. If there are any further incidents involving her, I will personally ensure that you face the full consequences of your actions." As the ambulances pulled away and the police finished their paperwork, word of what had happened began to spread throughout the small town. By morning, everyone in Milbrook would know that the quiet librarian was actually a decorated Navy SEAL, who had single-handedly taken down 5 attackers without breaking a sweat. Sarah's peaceful anonymity was over, but she had protected herself and innocent civilians from a group of violent men. She had done her job, just as she had been trained to do, and she could live with the consequences of that decision. By Saturday morning, The entire town of Milbrook was buzzing with news of what had happened at Murphy's Tavern. Social media had exploded overnight with eyewitness accounts, photos of the aftermath, and wild speculation about the mysterious librarian who had turned out to be a Navy SEAL. Tommy's phone video, which he had started recording as a joke, had been shared hundreds of times before the police confiscated it as evidence. Sarah woke up to find dozens of missed calls and text messages on her phone. News vans from 3 different television stations were parked outside her apartment building, and reporters were interviewing anyone they could find who had even a passing acquaintance with her. The quiet life she had sought in Milbrook was officially over. At the hospital, Jake Morrison was lying in bed with his nose packed with gauze and his face swollen beyond recognition. The doctors had successfully repaired his broken nose, but he would need several more surgeries to restore full function. More importantly, he was beginning to understand the full scope of the legal trouble he was facing. His lawyer, a public defender named Robert Chen, sat beside his bed with a stack of paperwork and a grim expression. "Jake, I'm not going to sugarcoat this," Chen said. "You're facing assault charges, battery charges, weapons charges, and possibly attempted murder charges. The district attorney is taking this very seriously." Jake tried to speak, but his voice was muffled by the bandages. "But she hurt me worse than I hurt her. Look at my face." Chen shook his head. "That's not how self-defense law works, Jake. She responded to your attack with reasonable force. You threatened her with a deadly weapon. A broken bottle is legally considered the same as a knife or a gun. You escalated this to the level of attempted murder, and she responded accordingly." The full weight of his actions was finally beginning to penetrate Jake's alcohol-damaged brain. He had gone from being the town tough guy to being the man who got destroyed by a librarian in front of multiple witnesses. Worse, he was facing serious prison time for his stupidity. Rick was in the next room dealing with his own legal problems. His concussion was severe enough that doctors were keeping him for observation, but his lawyer was delivering the same bad news. Both men were looking at significant jail time, and their reputations in the community were destroyed forever. Meanwhile, Sarah was trying to figure out how to handle the media attention. She had no experience dealing with reporters, and she valued her privacy above almost everything else. Her military service had been classified in many respects, and she wasn't comfortable discussing the details of her training or her missions. Around noon, there was a knock on her door. Sarah looked through the peephole and saw a woman in a business suit who didn't look like a reporter. She opened the door cautiously, keeping the chain lock engaged. "Ms. Martinez? My name is Linda Foster. I'm with the Department of Veterans Affairs. I'm here to offer you some assistance with this situation." Sarah removed the chain and opened the door. Linda Foster was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a professional demeanor. She carried a briefcase and identification that confirmed she was who she claimed to be. "I don't understand," Sarah said, inviting her in. "Why would the VA be involved in this?" Linda sat down in Sarah's small living room and opened her briefcase. "When former special operations personnel are involved in high-profile incidents, we like to make sure they have the support they need. This situation has the potential to become very complicated, and we want to help you navigate it." She pulled out several documents and handed them to Sarah. "We've arranged for legal representation if you need it, media training if you want it, and counseling services if the incident has triggered any trauma responses. We also have contacts who can help you relocate if the attention becomes too overwhelming." Sarah was surprised by the government's quick response. "I appreciate the offer, but I think I can handle this on my own." Linda smiled. "I'm sure you can, Ms. Martinez. Your service record indicates that you're more than capable of handling difficult situations, but you shouldn't have to handle this alone. The incident last night has generated national attention. There are already talk show producers calling our office asking for interviews." That evening, Sarah decided to make a brief public statement to try to control the narrative and hopefully reduce some of the media frenzy. She called a press conference at the town hall, with the mayor and police chief standing beside her for support. The room was packed with reporters, photographers, and curious townspeople. Sarah stepped up to the microphone wearing the same simple clothes she always wore, looking uncomfortable but determined. "My name is Sarah Martinez," she began, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "I moved to Milbrook 6 months ago, seeking a quiet life after 8 years of military service. Last night I was having dinner at Murphy's Tavern when I was approached by a group of intoxicated men who became increasingly aggressive despite my repeated requests that they leave me alone. She paused, looking out at the crowd of faces staring back at her. When one of these men threatened me with a broken bottle, I defended myself using the training I received during my military service. I used the minimum force necessary to protect myself and the other civilians in the restaurant. A reporter shouted out a question about her Navy SEAL training, but Sarah held up her hand. I will not be discussing the details of my military service or training. What I will say is that I never wanted this attention, and I hope that this incident serves as a reminder that you should never judge people by their appearance or assume you know what they're capable of. She stepped away from the microphone without taking questions, leaving the reporters to shout after her as she exited through a side door. The press conference had lasted less than 5 minutes, but it had accomplished what she wanted. She had controlled the narrative and made it clear that she wouldn't be participating in the media circus that was developing around the story. Back at the hospital, Jake Morrison watched Sarah's press conference on the television in his room. For the first time since the incident, he began to understand exactly who he had tried to intimidate and assault. This wasn't just some random woman who had gotten lucky. This was a highly trained military professional who had shown remarkable restraint in not seriously injuring or killing him and his friends. The realization of how close he had come to much worse consequences than a broken nose finally began to sink in. Sarah Martinez could have killed all 5 of them without breaking a sweat, and the only reason she hadn't was because of her professional discipline and respect for human life. For the first time in his adult life, Jake Morrison began to understand what real fear felt like. 3 weeks after the incident at Murphy's Tavern, life in Milbrook had settled into a new normal. The media attention had largely died down after Sarah's brief press conference, though she still occasionally received interview requests from national news programs and documentary filmmakers. She politely declined them all, preferring to let her actions speak for themselves. The legal proceedings moved forward quickly. Jake Morrison and Rick Williams both pled guilty to assault and battery charges in exchange for reduced sentences. Jake received 18 months in county jail, while Rick got 12 months. Tommy and Dave, who had cooperated fully with police and shown genuine remorse, received probation and community service. Mike, who had never actually participated in the assault, had all charges dropped. The district attorney, Margaret Thompson, held a press conference after the sentencing to address what had become a high-profile case. This incident serves as a clear reminder that actions have consequences, she told the assembled reporters. Ms. Martinez showed remarkable restraint in defending herself against multiple attackers, and the fact that no one was seriously injured is a testament to her professional training and discipline. Jake's time in jail was harder than he had expected. Word of his humiliation had spread throughout the correctional facility, and he found himself on the receiving end of the kind of bullying he had previously inflicted on others. Inmates who had heard about the librarian who destroyed 5 men in a bar fight made Jake's life miserable, constantly mocking him for being beaten up by a woman. But the experience also forced Jake to confront some uncomfortable truths about himself. In mandatory anger management classes, he began to understand how his behavior had escalated a simple misunderstanding into a life-changing catastrophe. He started to see how his need to prove his toughness had actually revealed his weakness and insecurity. 6 months into his sentence, Jake wrote a letter to Sarah Martinez. It took him dozens of drafts to find the right words, and he wasn't even sure she would read it. But he felt compelled to try to make some kind of amends for his actions. Dear Ms. Martinez, the letter began, I know I have no right to contact you, and I understand if you throw this letter away without reading it. But I needed to try to apologize for what I did to you that night at Murphy's Tavern. I was drunk and stupid, but that's no excuse for threatening you and making you fear for your safety. He continued, I've had a lot of time to think about that night, and I realize now that you could have hurt me much worse than you did. You showed me mercy that I didn't deserve, and I want you to know that I'm grateful for that. I'm also sorry that my actions forced you into a situation where you had to use your military training in a civilian setting. That must have been difficult for you. The letter concluded, I don't expect forgiveness and I don't expect a response. I just wanted you to know that I understand how wrong I was and that I'm working to become a better person. I hope you can find the peace and quiet life you were looking for in Milbrook. Sarah did read the letter when it arrived at the library where she continued to work. She was surprised by its sincerity and the insight it showed into the consequences of that night for everyone involved. She didn't respond to it, but she kept it, recognizing that it represented genuine growth and remorse from someone who had made terrible choices. The incident had changed Sarah's life in Milbrook in ways she hadn't expected. While she had lost her anonymity, she had gained something else: respect. The people of the town no longer saw her as just the quiet librarian. They saw her as someone who had the courage and ability to stand up to bullies and protect innocent people. Parents began bringing their teenage daughters to meet Sarah, hoping she might serve as a role model. The local high school asked her to speak at the assembly about self-defense and standing up to bullies. The mayor asked her to serve on the town's public safety committee. While she was still adjusting to the attention, Sarah began to see opportunities to make a positive difference in her adopted community. Murphy's Tavern had become something of a tourist attraction, with people coming from neighboring towns to see where the famous fight had taken place. Pete the bartender had framed a newspaper article about the incident and hung it behind the bar. He told anyone who would listen that Sarah was the bravest person he had ever met, and that Milbrook was lucky to have her. One evening, almost a year after the incident, Sarah was walking home from the library when she noticed a group of teenage boys harassing a younger kid near the town square. The older boys were clearly bullying the smaller one, pushing him around and laughing at his distress. Sarah approached the group calmly. "Is there a problem here?" she asked. The teenagers recognized her immediately. Everyone in town knew who Sarah Martinez was and what she was capable of. The bullies quickly backed away from their victim and scattered in different directions without saying a word. The younger boy, who couldn't have been more than 12 years old, looked up at Sarah with gratitude and awe. "Thank you, Ms. Martinez," he said. "They were trying to take my lunch money." Sarah smiled and walked the boy home, making sure he was safe. As she reflected on the encounter, she realized that her presence in the community had created a deterrent effect that extended far beyond that night at Murphy's Tavern. The knowledge that there was someone in town who wouldn't tolerate bullying had made Milbrook a safer place for everyone. The incident had taught everyone involved valuable lessons. Jake Morrison learned that his perceived toughness was actually weakness, and that real strength comes from controlling yourself, not controlling others. The community learned not to judge people by their appearance and to respect the quiet heroes who walk among them. And Sarah learned that sometimes the very skills that make you want to hide from the world are the same skills the world needs you to share. In the end, what had started as a simple desire for a peaceful dinner had become a reminder that some people will always try to take advantage of those they perceive as weak. But it had also shown that when good people are pushed too far, they have the power to push back in ways that bullies never expect. Jake Morrison and his friends had learned the hard way why you should never, ever provoke someone whose capabilities you don't understand, and why assuming someone is defenseless based on their appearance is always a dangerous mistake.